Yeah, we're going to do the hard scrolls today. And I am assuming that you have some experience in forging and in forging scrolls on this, but we're going to do the blown over leaf and the beveled scroll, which are they're the tricky ones. So most scrolls, there's lots of different kinds of scrolls. We're scrolling something over the edge and we're bending it the easy way. Thin, thick, we're bending it the easy way. These scrolls, these weird scrolls, do a flip. So they start off flat or almost flat. And then as you come around on the scroll from the center outwards, they turn to being on edge. And that gives them a lot of excitement, but it makes them hard to make. So quick rundown on these scrolls. The bevel scroll. Here's a bevel scroll, another bevel scroll. Lovely thing. It's got a simple taper on it. It's got a bevel on the surface that you see. So there's a couple of different facets there to catch the light. It's wider, apparently, in the center. And as you come out, it ends up narrower because it does a half twist from being almost flat to being on edge. Things I like, I love the visual line weight change. So it looks wide in the middle and it gently, gradually changes, which adds some real dynamics to it. I also really like the negative space in the center, that space defined by the line of the metal, which is really nice and round. It reminds me of a halfpenny scroll. Things that might be an issue, depending what you're doing, is it has a front and it has a back. And so it's not going to be as useful in a place where people are going to see it equally from both sides. So you want to think about that. Also, because of the nature of it, it's really hard to forge the center terribly tight. This is about as tight as you can get it. Any tighter than that is very, very hard to do. The blown over leaf scroll has this lovely, lively, very alive leaf in the middle, a waving or blowing leaf. It does the half twist from the leaf just in the first half turn there to being up on edge. This is an interesting one to me because in most scrolls, the middle of the scroll is not in the middle, but in this one, the leaf is pretty close to the center, at least in a small scroll. And so that's kind of fun. I love the leaf because it's not literal, but it's still very organic. So it has this graphic sense, but it's organic. And again, the line weight changed from having this thin line coming up, scrolling inwards, and then pow, you've got this sudden feature on the end. Again, it has a front and a back. The back is not as interesting as the front. And the tip here is actually bent forwards. That gives it life, but it means that there's a tip that can snag clothing. So you might not want to use it down on some handrails or something where people might rub against it. Just some reminders of fundamentals on scrolling. We're going to be using these. Scrolls are generally done over an edge, and the metal is generally at a 90-degree angle to the edge when you are forging it over. If you do it at a funny angle, the scroll comes out really weird, right? Important thing to remember. You're hammering over air when you scroll. In order to get a nice bend, any place that you hit, the other side should be air, not anvil. You're going off the edge of an anvil, not against an anvil. We always start scrolling from the tip of the scroll and we work back. And we usually scroll down first, and then we might bring it over and pat it on its butt to scroll it up. If, when you're scrolling, we want nice curves. If you ever get a kink, it's going to have flat spots next to it. If you get a kink, hit it on the kink. That will even things out. If you hit it on a flat spot, it makes the kink worse. This is so obvious and yet so important. If you want it to bend someplace, make sure you heat it there. And if you don't want something to move, quench it to lock it. When you get from the center of the scroll outwards, you don't want that middle hot when you're working on the outside, because if you do, this can change. And I've seen it happen. I've seen it unscroll, which is so depressing. So quench the stuff that's good before you go on every single heat. Last thought on scrolling. In order to learn from your problems, I won't call them mistakes, and to replicate the things that worked well, take lots and lots of notes. record the shapes of things at various points, record where you put the bevels, record what the results were, record measurements, so that if it comes out well, you can repeat it. And if it doesn't come out well, you can analyze it and see what the heck happened and what you were working with so that it doesn't happen again. I'm going to do these two scrolls basically in parallel because there's a lot that's the same. And that way you're going to get more reinforcement of each step. But there are some differences. So there are 4.5 basic steps. Usually when we make a scroll, there's 2 steps. Make the finial, the ending, and then scroll it. Here, 4 steps and a bit. We're going to forge the finial as usual. We're going to scroll it, but the first scroll isn't done the usual direction, the easy way. It's done the hard way, meaning we're trying to bend the flat of the material this way while the thin is staying flat. Then we're going to put in some nice bevels, which can catch the light, which I always like. And then we're going to stop before we get to step 4, which is the hard one. And we're going to do a test in paper. We're going to take our scroll, put it on a piece of paper or light card. Cereal box is good. Trace it, cut it out, and make yourself a little model. So here's my little piece. Notice I drew a line for the center line. That helps me see the axis. Well, when you scroll, you always scroll off an edge and you're scrolling with the edge at 90 degrees, right? So that's like putting a bunch of little folds in at 90 degrees. If you do a series of little folds, you can simulate that little arc, right? Do that with this all the way along. Start at the tip, put little folds in, and each fold, you have to be really careful. Each fold has to be exactly, or as close as you can, 90 degrees to that center line. Well, that means they're changing a lot, right? So put all your little folds in and you end up with something like this. So it has lots of folds and there's my line. You can see each fold is perpendicular to that center line, but that means they're all at different angles. I'm doing these folds maybe every 3 to 5 millimeters. Once you got that, then you can test it out. You can grab the ends and sort of go, okay, with what it's doing naturally, if I scroll it up, does it do what I need it to do? And I'm going to bend it until I like the negative space. I'm looking at that space in between, making it nice. And you know what? This one, when I bend it around to have a decent negative space, it's not ending up on edge. Remember, we wanted that to be on edge in the end. And if I put it on edge, I get a weird kink in it. So that means that this starting shape is wrong. And I need to do a different starting shape. Other thing to do, make 2 more copies and do one for each of the wrong directions. So instead of being at a right angle to the anvil edge, we're going to do this angle, and we'll do another one at that angle. So we're feeding it off the anvil edge wrong. Putting it on there, you can see the little angles to the center line and see what they do. This one, when it does its natural bend, it corkscrews. It comes up out of the plane. And if I try and put it back into the plane, it's doing some really nasty, kinky things. So that's a problem. And this one, going the other angle there to my edge, no matter what I do, it never finishes flipping. No matter how tight you get it, it never actually flips down here. You can use these 2 examples to figure out what you did wrong on this step, which when your scroll doesn't come out right on the 4th scrolling, you can go, oh, okay, cool. So finials, we want to, the beveled scroll just has a taper in 2 directions, and the blown over leaf has something that's kind of leaf-like. The beveled scroll, it's a radius taper on both of these. You start off with the radius taper. The beveled scroll, it's a little longer, 2 to 3 times the width of the material, and we thin the tip just a little bit. Blown over leaf, the same thing's going on, but it's a shorter taper. And then we need to do some stuff to separate out a leaf and to actually get it to look alive. So let's take a look at that. So here's our starting tapers. These are radius tapers, not straight tapers, because when you scroll these guys the hard way, the outside stretches, the inside compresses. If we do that with a straight piece, it's really hard to do. And it ends up looking kind of awful really easily. Really compressed. It's actually lumping up in the center there. By doing the radius, we've already got this outside line much longer than the inside line. So the inside doesn't have to compress as much and the outside doesn't have to stretch as much. And so you end up getting a scroll happening much better. The beveled scroll, which is the upper one, should be 2 to 3 times in length what it is in width. And it should be moderately pointy at the end. The blown over leaf should be much shorter. The length should be no more than 1.5 times the width. And it should be steeper on the end. On each of these, you're going to end up keeping the thickness the same, but you want to, at the very tip, come down to the lower picture, you can see I've just put a very short taper in the thickness. I've only brought it down to maybe half of the original thickness, and not too much. And it's a very short taper. I think that's about 10 millimeters long on this little piece. But that makes it have that nice finish so it doesn't look chunky on the end. So with the bevel, you're done. With the blown over leaf scroll, we now need to do the separation, which we're doing over the rounded corner on the anvil. And that produces the leaf, the base of the leaf, and a nice tapered section that'll be the stem of the leaf. Now you notice that the bottom is flat and the top is arced. If we flip it over and get it on the horn and give it a little tap, then we can take that flat bottom and turn it into an arc. And we'll take the, turn it to an arc, and the top will get a little swing backwards, which anytime you have a big bend and then a little bend, that really helps things to look organic. So, all right. And that's your finial forging. The scroll number 1, scrolling the hard way. The beveled scroll, it's pretty much a simple scroll, but you're doing it on edge the hard way. You want to keep it flat. It needs to be long enough. It doesn't need to be super tight, but it does need to be long enough. We'll get into what happens if it's not. So you notice this bend down here. That's pretty important. It's got to bend all the way out to almost the edge of the anvil. The blown over leaf, it's just a 90-degree bend right next to the leaf, right at that base of the leaf, in the stem. And it can be a little more or a little less. I usually do it over the horn so it's nice and rounded. So again, the hard way, you're scrolling from the tip on the beveled scroll. It doesn't need to be as tight. This bend doesn't need to be as tight as the final design. It will tighten when you do the second scroll. You do, though, need to have a long, gentle bend. This one's coming all the way down to here. That funny shape actually works. And you, of course, want to keep it flat. Blown over leaf, you're just putting a little 90-degree bend in. That's it. Something like that. Nice and round. Should be right next to the base of the leaf. Keep it flat. That's all there is. A note on the beveled scroll. You want to make sure it's got a long enough, gentle arc. If you've got a nice scrolling at the beginning, but then you just sort of stop, so it ends up a little bit like a lollipop on a stick, it will not do the flip. The flip is impossible. The two on the left here are pretty good. They could maybe use a little bit more bend further on. The one on the right is bad. It will not work, among other things. This sort of tipped over lollipop thing. It's too much of a constant radius on the inside for too much length. It's not expanding, right? The curve just stops just beyond the outside edge of the center of the scroll. That is not going to work. You need to have bend much further down. And the taper's really skinny on the inside. Doesn't it look wussy and horrible? Do not like that one. I'm going to point out before I go on the beveled scrolls here on the left. The one on the bottom, the two bevels meet each other to form a little ridge line most of the way. The one on the top, there's only a meeting at the very tip, and otherwise there's 3 surfaces most of the way. These are choices that you get to make as the artist. So speaking of the bevels, you're putting bevels on everything. You always do bevels starting at the tip, and you work back along the piece. Start at the tip, work back. Start on the inside first before you do the outside. Why? When you hammer on that surface on the outside, it it makes that section a little longer, which causes the whole scroll to tighten. And then it's really hard to get a hammer on the inside. If you do the inside first, this inner edge gets longer. The whole scroll expands and opens, but it's fine because as soon as you work on the outside, it'll tighten again. So work from the inside first, outside second. Overlapping blows are going to give you fewer hammer marks. Think about making nice transitions from where you're ending it back to the flat. What's that going to look like? Be thoughtful. And on the blown over leaf, everything's kind of the same, but you need to keep in mind that the bevel line there is the leaf vein. So it's part of what makes it look alive. And if it's in the wrong place, it doesn't look like a leaf. I actually had a lot of problems figuring out how to do those. And that's one where I got out the notebook and I traced one of my bevel scroll blanks 6 times and started drawing lines until I figured out what looked good. And I'll show you what I actually like. Putting in the bevels, I like to use a rounding hammer with a fairly gentle rounded face. I'm using the rounding hammer on the inside edges so that the corners of the hammer don't nick it. And of course, working on the near side of the anvil. And then I flip over and use the flat side on the far side of the anvil so that I don't get too many hammer marks. So this is what we should end up with. The beveled scroll, pretty well centered on the mountain if you make a mountain. I like it sometimes to be a little bit further to the outside, right at the very tip. I think that looks a little better. And then a nice transition back into the flat. The blown over leaf, what I have found looks better is that at the tip, that ridge is closer to the top surface than the top edge than the bottom edge. And at the stem of the leaf, the ridge is closer to the bottom edge of the stem than the top edge. And it's got to have a nice curve in between those two to give it the life. And again, a nice transition out. So we've done steps 1, 2, and 3. We're amazing. This is where you got to get out your paper and make a test and do the bends 90 degrees and not 90 degrees and play with it and see what happens. Because if this can't work, if you can't make this look good and do the flip naturally without having to force it and kink the paper and fight the natural bends on there, then there's a problem with your original shape. So this is a shape that had a problem with it. And in fact, when I made a scroll, I don't actually like that scroll very much. This guy, I'll show it to you again, but with the weird kind of kink down here, it makes a really nice beveled scroll. When you scroll it up, it does the flip beautifully and gradually. Experimenting is good. I actually learned that by experimenting with clay because I could make a lot of mistakes very quickly. Okay, so now we're into the actual hard part. The second scrolling, the easy way, which is the way we always scroll scrolls, right? What's the problem? I do suggest that if you're working on this, you take a break before this section and get your brain kind of moved over, because this is the part that can really mess with you. And if you speed it up too much, the chances of screwing up are higher. And the frustration is just amazing. First, we need to be able to bend over an edge, but there's no way we can just work against an anvil because the scroll will run into the anvil side. So we need to work on something pointier like a horn. And if you have a nice bicorn anvil and one of the horns is square edged, you're good. Just use the square horn on your anvil. And if you don't, then this is a great solution, which is to take a piece of chalk and just run it horizontally along your horn on both sides. And that will give you your quote unquote edge. It's just a little below the top, nice kind of horizontal line. And that's the edge that I'm going to use so I can visually see it to get my angles right. So for every single blow, we want to set it up 90 degrees, start at the tip, work our way back, and we want to hammer it down, actually at 90 degrees, to the axis. So this is what it should look like on the left, is at the point where the scroll is crossing the white line on the horn, that at that point, that axis should be 90 degrees. The little mountain that you've made, the ridge line, should be at 90 degrees to the chalk mark. And it should be at 90 degrees at the chalk mark and a little bit off the side of the horn from the chalk mark, because that's where the bend is going to be. On the right, we have the no-nos. The upper one, we've got it cranked around so that we've got an angle of less than 90 degrees on this top edge between the axis and the chalk mark. And on the bottom, we've cranked it the other way. And right here, we've got an angle that's bigger than 90 degrees. Now, if I go back along this scroll, at the top of the anvil, it is actually perpendicular, but that's not where the bend is happening. So this is why you have to know where you're looking, and where the chalk mark, I think, makes a huge difference. If you're using that square horn, you just use the edge. And isn't that lovely? Additionally, we have to worry about another thing. When you're scrolling, you keep the metal flat on the anvil as you're feeding it forward, right? It sits flat. You don't let it come up onto one edge, because that doesn't work. Same thing here. We are not only worrying about having that in the right spot relative to where we want the bend to be, and having it at a perpendicular angle between the ridge line and the chalk line, but we also need to have it flat on the horn, or it's not going to work right. So this first one, there's the tip, and then you can see in the lower photo, I've rotated around and I'm working further back. I could actually stand to, I think my hand should probably drop down a little bit there. It's not quite flat. I'm not entirely happy. What does it look like when you're doing a blown over leaf? We've been looking at beveled scrolls. Well, so on the left, we have the beveled scroll, 90 degrees between the axis where it crosses the chalk line and the chalk line. And on the right, you can see the beveled scroll, where that ridge line, again, that we've got is at 90 degrees to the chalk line. So that's our setup. Other little thoughts. Use a mallet. You've got these beautiful bevels that you spent time putting in. And of course you're hammering over air, and so everything should bend and nothing should happen to them. But this is just a nice little safety thing. Nothing can happen to your bevels if you hit it with a mallet. Start at the tip, work back, make sure every bend is 90 degrees to the axis. You're going to have to walk around the horn as you do this. So make sure you move your anvil to a spot where you can walk around the horn. If it's kind of tucked in over near something, you're going to want to move that. Anything that looks good, quench it before you keep going. If that middle looks good, quench it before you keep going. And the flip, going from it being almost flat to being on edge, should happen within the part that's bent that was bent the first time we scrolled it, when we scrolled it the hard way, scroll number 1. If you get down past that bend and it hasn't flipped, it's not gonna flip, and you need to undo it because you have the wrong starting shape. Blown over leaf, pretty much the same, but a couple things. One, first thing we need to do is to add some life to the leaf. So we're going to be taking this flat thing and bending the leaf, putting a nice big lively bend in it, and then bending the tip back just a little bit forward. So it's got two big bend, small bend things going on, one in each of 2 dimensions. And that gives it that blown over or waving in the wind look. Also, as you're getting towards the end, once you've got the flip happened and you get into this section here, be a little careful. If you make this guy too high or too round, you can end up with a pinch point in the negative space, which never looks good. I think the best thing to do is to make this surface echo the edge, the upper edge of the leaf, so that that space ends up nice, because good negative space makes a huge difference. Okay. What we're going to try and do here is I'm going to show you videos of the second scrolling, because I think that's the hardest part to envision and to see how much time I have to spend on setting each of these up. So it's going to take 2 to 3 heats, and we're going to go through, and I may stop it occasionally and show you something, but should hopefully work. So I'm out at the end of the horn. You can see my chalk mark. There's my very tip, just past the chalk, whacking it down like we always do when we're scrolling. Brought it out a little further. Okay, brought it out a little further, adjusting it. All right, let me get one more here. There we go. Forward a little bit. Now, a number of things are going on. First of all, I'm having to walk around the anvil, right? But each time I'm moving this forward a little bit, because that's what you do when you scroll, so that there's air underneath. Then I'm adjusting it so that it's aligned so that the ridge is perpendicular to the chalk line. That's the second thing I'm doing. Then I'm making sure that the metal is flat on the horn, not lifted up on one edge. I'm doing all of that before I bend this section, hit over air, and scroll down on this edge. And it takes me a fair amount of time to get some of these set up. It's like, okay, that looks pretty good. Move it forward a little bit, change the angle a little bit, move it forward a little bit, change the angle. And there's my first heat. Now notice, it's gotten a little tighter here. Cool. But particularly, notice here, we're looking at the edge a little bit. It started the flip. This isn't tight enough yet, but the flip has started. So that's great. All right, so second heat, I'm starting at the tip again because I want to make the whole middle tighter. Sticking it out as much as I can. It's getting more awkward because I have to be right out at the tip. Again, notice there's air underneath where I'm going to hit. I'm not hitting against the anvil. I'm hitting past the anvil. Down, moving it forward, adjusting the angle, forward, getting the angle adjusted, making sure it's flat, flattening it. There, I'm flattening it. Okay. It's better to take the time to set it up. Forward, angle adjustment, down. Forward, angle adjustment. Now there's less bend, so it's a little bit easier. Oh, a little angle adjustment using what heat I've got. And there's the end of my second heat. Now notice how much tighter it is up in the center of the scroll. And then as we come down, it's just very gently rolling. So we haven't completed the flip, but it's most of the way there. So we just need to work down in this section and we should be able to finish the flip. The center though, I like how the center looks. So maybe I should protect that a little bit on this next heat. So starting off by quenching the center to lock it in so it can't undo, and only leaving heat where I want to change things. So tightening up stuff where I want to tighten it up. Same thing, always over air, making sure I'm 90 degrees every single time. Working it along. And I got a funny little thing happening here. So this is just, I got a little curve to it in a weird dimension. And we all know that if you try and hit that down with the hammer, it's not going to work. You got to always put humps so that the bend so that the hump is up, hit it on top of the hump, and it'll go away. And that's what I've just done here. Just straightening that out a little bit, and presto. Tight center, nice, gently expanding thing. And by the time we're just getting to the end of where it was bent in scroll number 1, the flip is completed. And we've got this flat center and we're on edge there, which is great. And the blown over leaf is going to start by making that leaf have some life to it. Okay, I'm actually scrolling it. So there's the leaf, bending it down, nice big bend, and then coming back and getting the tip bent the other way, which is awkward and requires jamming my hand against my leg. But that gives it some nice life. You can see it's got a big bend and then the tip waves back up, and that's what makes it a blown over leaf. So now I'm starting at the base of the leaf, the top of the stem, and I start scrolling there. Setting up that right angle, advancing it a little bit, setting up the right angle. Look how much I have to bring it around to get it to a right angle. Setting it, bringing it forward, making sure it's a right angle, making sure there's air underneath, bringing it forward. And I'm past the bend now, so there's into the straight section. We've got it starting to roll. There's the edge. That's good. The flip is happening. The center is not nearly scrolled enough. And so I need to go back and really start right at the base of the leaf and tighten that up so that that leaf ends up inside the middle of the scroll, aiming the right way. So let's go to 1301. Where are we at? 1301. So here's our next heat. Again, I'm starting right at the base of the leaf because it needs to tighten there. And it's a little awkward to get it laying down flat on the horn, advancing it a little bit, big swing around, making sure everything's just right. Whoop. Okay. Now I'm past the bend. And what I'm paying attention to, I'm in the straightaway now. I'm just scrolling, but I'm looking at the arc that I'm forming versus the lower edge of the leaf, the edge of the leaf that's nearest to it, to try to make those look harmonious together. And there we go. Now, I've got the leaf, I've got the flip, I've got nice negative space here. If I want to scroll it up more, now it's just normal scrolling. Now I go to the edge of the anvil, and that's not too difficult. So we can go just a little bit here. We'll take a look at what that looks like. Whoops. So I can go edge of the anvil, just scrolling like normal, and scrolled it up some more. I could get some more in there, but this leaf is tucked in nicely. See how tight that bend is to tuck that leaf in. That's part of what makes it look good. It's really different from almost basically all others. I'm a big fan of learning what makes things look bad and what may have happened. So here's a couple of bad beveled scrolls to look at. The one on the left, it's got a decent bevel on it. It's kind of nice. Although the very tip, we got like a flat spot. So when we were doing scroll number 1, apparently too much was hanging off the edge. It's that classic flat spot in the middle of a scroll problem. Then it's all right, but you notice how it's not flipping at all. It's just staying at the same angle the whole time. And then suddenly between the top and the side, this little quarter turn, it flips, but it's kind of more of a kink than anything. So the outline on that is pretty horrible. The one on the right, it does start to flip. It again, I think the tip here was probably I made the taper too thin, and so it folded instead of scrolling nicely. Don't make that taper too thin at the front. It's coming around and it starts to flip, which is great. And then the flip doesn't change like at all, and it never finishes. Also, I must have scrolled it a little too tight in here. My negative space isn't expanding because the negative space pinches down as I go from partway along to further along, and that looks pretty horrible. This guy, because it didn't flip, must not have had the right shape to start with. After scroll 1, it was the wrong shape. The one on the left, I suspect that was me getting the angles wrong on scroll number 2, that I got some of the scroll angles not so right. And that's why it did that horrible thing. So good beveled scrolls, it should end up in one plane, right? Should end up in one plane, not corkscrewing. The flip should be incremental and smooth, no sudden things like that one that I showed you on the left. And it should flip to fully on edge, unlike the one on the right. I like a nice kind of snub end negative space and smooth shapes inside and out. Corkscrewing is bad. Having a loop where it comes around and touches itself on a stick instead of being an expanding scroll, not so good. Sudden flips are bad. No flip is really bad. If the negative space, as you come outwards, gets smaller at any point, and here it's getting bigger, as we work our way out, it gets wider. But if it pinches, that's nasty. We don't want any kinks or weird bevels or whatever. So here's some blown over leaves. On the left, you've got the backside, so you can see them. On the right, the top one, it does a nice little flip. I like the negative space. I like the life to the leaf. The one on the bottom, the leaf has some nice life to it, but the flip never really happened. But it's kind of scrolled too tight in the wrong places. I would love to go back and scroll it tighter right next to the base of the leaf and a little looser further on. And that might actually possibly fix it. So we want a nice flowing leaf. We want a short, distinctive leaf. If you make that leaf too long, if you do those first half face blows too far back, you end up with it grows and you get sort of a willow leaf or a eucalyptus leaf, and it doesn't look good inside of a scroll. The The tightest bend should be next to the leaf, right in that leaf stem. And I'll show you the negative space in a sec. The leaf, if it's bad if it doesn't have life, if it doesn't have a base to the leaf, if the leaf sort of suddenly just turns into the main bar without having a bottom to the leaf, that's not good. No flip is bad. And there's some ways that scrolling can look very strange coming out of there. Let's take a look at some negative space here. I love the negative space on the bottom bevel scroll, just that nice expanding roundedness. The top one, when I showed this to some kids when I was working this stuff out, they said, oh, it looks like the negative space looks like a brontosaurus. Okay, it's a cartoon dinosaur. And I agree. I think the one that looked bad, let me go back up a few. On the bottom here, you got a big negative space blob, and then you got a skinny little gap. So it's like an alien head on a pencil neck. And I think that looks dreadful. So these guys, I think those look all right. And that is more than enough. So I'd love to hear your questions.
Well, thank you, Beth. This has been a fantastic presentation. I loved how you make up for some bit of longitude in some of the sections. Yeah, fantastic presentation. And at least talking for myself, I will probably rewatch this after starting the level 3 grill in the near future.
Yeah. These are good things to practice many times before you try to do them to measure.
Yeah.
Nothing.
I think you did too good a job.
I'm sorry. I have the paper thing. This is, I got that from Mark Asbury, and the idea of learning how it works by using the paper. But then when I figured out I could do it to test the shapes, that just really helped out. Because otherwise you're kind of guessing, is it going to flip? Is it not going to flip? I don't know. Is it going to look good when it flips?
That's a very good, little trick, that paper, isn't it? It visualizes it, doesn't it, very well.
Yeah, visual, and it's physical, right? It's tactical. So you can really, yeah, I love that.
Yeah, I thought that was really innovative, actually. That was good.
Again, not my innovation. I've just expanded on somebody else's concept.
Beth, what's the trade-off between beveling before you scroll, and is beveling while the bevel is straight versus creating the bevel after it's curved?
You're saying, hey, what if I just did my taper, my radius taper, and then beveled it now?
Yes.
So the thing is, again, as soon as we start to scroll it, and we're going to scroll it first the hard way, there's a lot of compression on the inside edge and a lot of stretching on the outside edge, right? So if you put the bevel in now, where that ends up relative to the whole thing after the scrolling, you're not in complete control. Scrolling it, being able to smack it to flatten it and adjust it, and then you put the bevel in, you're putting the bevel in so that it's relative to what this shape is, right? I like it a little bit, not necessarily centered here, but I like it in the middle here. And I can see, where do I want to fade it out? How does that look? There's no way I can see that properly on this. And I think it would probably end up with some weird bends in it. I don't think it'd come out nice at all. This isn't that hard to do. You do have to, you're working it with the hammer, and you have to do some moving around, and especially on the outside edge, you're having to kind of shift things around a lot, but it's not that tricky. It's not that tricky. Then certainly there's no way you can do it on the leaf. If you beveled it first and then did that, I don't see anything good happening.
In the meantime, there has come a comment from Monica Kjellman-Sharpin. Really fantastic presentation, Biff. Really want to go back to work now and try some of these scrolls.
They're interesting scrolls. And I have to say, the first time I learned them, which was, we spent a lot of times on steps 1, 2, and 3. There was no 3.5. And then step 4 was, and then get on the horn and kind of hammer it around until it's the right way, which was incredibly frustrating and gave me some no control and some really weird results. And I think getting that broken down more for me has made a big difference. It means that when I do screw it up, and I still screw them up, I'm able to look at it and say, oh, you got them angled like that. Go back and change where the bend is, and it'll all come out fine. I think it's doable. It's just a matter of breaking it down. Anything else?
Well,
no? Who else likes doing these scrolls?
Well, I have a question.
Yeah.
Maybe some other people can also think about theirs further. There's maybe first the comment by Steve. A book that covers traditional scrolls is the Kuziro book, Wrought Ironwork, a manual instruction for craftsmen. I think that has been reprinted a few times and so is still available.
And it's available for free on, among other places, as downloads. If you don't know about it yet, the BAM website, the Blacksmithing Association of Missouri, they have a set of free downloads of books that are out of copyright, so it's legal. And they've done most of the Kosira books in small downloadable chunks, so you can get it if you don't have it. Also in the US, for example, Blue Moon Press, Tinkerberger, is reprinting them in hardcover, so you can actually have it on paper, which is great. That book is great. Although I have to say, my experience, I first learned them, both of these scrolls, from the Kosira book. And I feel like there's some missing bits, and especially in that last scroll. The leaf design is a much more gentle leaf. It doesn't have as distinctive a bottom as this, which is fine. It's just it's an alternative, right? But yeah, those are great. And I love that the bevel is different, because that when I was showing you two different bevels, the upper one came from Kosira, and it's just beveled on the outer edges. They only meet at the tip, and it's changed to a sort of, I don't know, we seem to have now gone to the bevels must meet and we must have a ridge all the way down. And it's a choice, right? And some people are going really extreme. I like a fairly, low key bevel. Some people like a really pointy bevel, or even one that's got like, they get out their ball peen and they really work that puppy into a wave. And it's all just choices. But the Kosira book is those are great.
I think what like you say, Beth, once you've mastered the art of getting the material to change the plane and reduce the bevel, you're free then to experiment with it, aren't you, and create your own version of it.
Yep. What would happen if you made the leaf more leafy, as in a thinner stem? Oh, that's a really good question. So I would encourage you the first time to make the leaf stem no more than half the original width. Leave some meat in there so that it still is a flat piece when you're doing that second scroll. If it gets thinner, it's not flat anymore. But do a few this way and then play with it. You could do that. I think it'd be fascinating to do it with the stem round, right? Wouldn't that be cool? But there's so much more to keep track of to make sure that you're actually forging it down the right way on that second scrolling when it's on a round surface. But I think you could do that. I just think you should start with this before you make that too thin. As I mentioned, the Kosira book, it's not even like that. It's just a little bit of a dent. And I think they thin it this way on the horn just a weeny bit in order to make it bend more readily. Because it gets a really tight bend in it on the final scroll. That's a really, really tight bend. But wouldn't that be fun to play with? And again, I think it's good to start with really short leaves on this. They will grow more than you think. But that'd be something to play around with too, is could you make a longer leaf, but then do something with the life of the leaf so it takes up less space so that the scroll is still moderately tight? That could be a cool thing. These are exciting adventures.
I have a question. So I learned these blown over leaf scrolls. I think I learned it last year in UK. That one just does the 90-degree bend of the leaf, then scrolls it up how I would you usually do it, and then just bend it over and hammer it into right direction. That's actually how I did it.
So you have a flag hanging out
Yes,
And
and
then
then
you
you
scroll it this
scroll in
way,
this direction, and
and
then
then you
you
go,
forge this over. Yes.
okay.
So, and
I
this
think,
is how I did it. This is only the explanation part of the question. So,
right?
this is how I did on the level 2 grill, and I was wondering if one could do something similar if one has like a bowl-ish shape. If one does plenty of if one has to do for a project plenty of the bevel scrolls, that one has it until where the bevel is in, and then just forges it into the bowl dish, or however one wants to call it. I don't know how
Wow.
better to call it.
Yeah. That's a really interesting thought. I'd get very familiar with this before I tried that shortcut. It's a little like going straight to using a jig for your scrolls before you know how to scroll well. You just lose, you're so dependent on your tooling, and you can't even learn to see what looks right. And I'm into learning how to see what looks right. I think the way to test that would be to try it in modeling clay, right? And see if you could actually get the right result. Modeling clay is a great way to make a lot of mistakes very fast. I love it for that. I'm not convinced because of the compound bends. I'm really worried that unless you got it exactly the right shape and then perfectly evenly hot before you did the down into a single plane, that it could end up kinky or not working on the bend, because you still have to have it up on edge by the time it's all the way around. That's a very interesting thing to think about, what the jig tooling would be to be able to incrementally do that. Because certainly you could jig your first bend, right? It'd be a little awkward, and you'd have to use it really carefully to not end up with a lot of marks from your scrolling wrench around here, right? But that's a really interesting experiment. You're doing a lot of them.
I think that would be really quite difficult to jig. You'd spend a lot of time making a jig to do that. I think you'd be better investing the time in practicing making them.
Yep. And they get faster, once you've got and for any given one that you're making, once you've got your master one this way, and you know exactly what your initial taper was, and you do the taper, and you do the scroll, and you do the bevel, which you still have to do the bevel by hand, right? If you've got the right tooling, and you've got it down, it's not too bad, and you'll get really repetitive like you do with anything else. Right tooling, I would say an easier tooling for this is a long stake anvil might be useful, like a tin knocker stake, so that you could really get it on there and it would never run into itself. That might make it a little bit easier than the standard horn. The horn's great for learning on, but if you were doing some custom tooling, that would be the piece of custom tooling I would go to, is using a long stake anvil. So yeah, I'm agreeing. Sandra is saying, nice statement on learning to scroll before moving to a jig. If you can do it with an anvil and a hammer, you can do it anywhere. Exactly. As long as there's a hammer and an anvil or something with an edge, you can figure out how to do it. And if you're doing something in production, you've got to come up with ways to make it fast. Absolutely agreed. But I'm not sure what that is here. I also think that there's a reason why people should pay more money for grill work that has these in it. This is an expensive scroll because it takes time and skill. It is more expensive than even a lovely hay penny, right? That one's about £1, isn't it? Than a penny. This is cheaper than this, and it should be, and you should charge accordingly. So I also have to say that these scrolls, I think it's fun to. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just picking up on what you're saying. I think unless you've got hundreds of something to make,
right,
that's a different ball game. But I think if you're making small numbers, making them by hand, you get quite quick at it after a while. But they're never identical, and that's what gives the work a lot of, I think, energy and liveliness, which distinguishes it from the factory-made articles people are faced with nowadays.
Yep. And it's exactly the thing to point out, you know, when you're talking to clients. I'm thinking of, you know, some years back, a factory-made version of the welded basket twist, you know, the 4 strands thing came out, and they're everywhere, and they're just buzz welded into the middle of things where they make no sense at all. And I just hope that nobody ever figures out a way to do this. And I don't think they will. This will always mark us as unique. And yeah, a little variation is part of what gives it that not horrible variation where it's like, oh, they look terrible together, but where it's like, yeah, a human being made this. Those are hammer blows. Yeah, I think it's good. I also follow up is these are doable. It takes some practice. It takes some focus. It takes some note taking, but they're doable. And what's great is once you've learned these, honestly, these are a great way to show another blacksmith that you're a blacksmith. So if you're in a new situation or you're traveling and you say, yeah, I'm a blacksmith, right? Somebody says, I'm a blacksmith. You're like, I wonder what that means. And if you whip out a blown over leaf scroll, they go, oh, you're a blacksmith. And now you know what language you're both speaking, right? The language of the hammer. So it's fun that way too. But I think they're nice looking. Other questions? Everybody's feeling totally like, I got this. It's good.
Yeah, I don't know what I think. I guess I guess it's when you get them into more complex I suppose, you know, compositions of work, and you forge welding them together, etc. Then I guess it becomes a bit more of a fiddle, keeping everything where it should be and then manipulating it, doesn't it? But that's the same with a lot of things, I guess.
Exactly. Well, I think it's fun to look at ironwork that's out there and look for these guys and variations on these guys and spot them and go, how can I mess with it and get that? I've seen some really interesting ones. I might be able to find a couple of them, but if you're doing the level 3 grill, these guys on the right are these C-scrolls that are in the middle, and they have to be symmetrical to each other and to themselves. So you're doing one of the hard scrolls, 2 different directions with complete symmetry, and you've got to get them the right length on the end of the bar, like all C-scrolls. That's a pain in the ass, you know? And I really wanted it to come out looking not just like a beveled scroll, but like a beveled scroll that matched the drawing. So figuring out what shape the original was before I did the second scroll, I ended up, I did my sort of initial piece, and then I put the bevel in, and then I bent it into a C scroll. And then I used my fingers and I adjusted it until it actually looked like the drawing that I wanted. And I made sure that it was actually doing the bend that I wanted and the flip that I wanted. And then I took that and I carefully unwrapped it and went, okay, that's my starting shape. That's what the first scroll needs to do. And that's where I got this weird kink here. That was from making the level 3 grill, that I had to make almost continuous. This is basically the same radius here for not quite 180 degrees, and then a straight section, and then a long kink. And that came out perfectly. Mm-hmm. How bizarre. But the plasticine, the modeling clay, made all the difference on being able to figure that out. It's a great way to figure it. There was another one I saw. Well, if we feel like it, folks want to see it. I saw a variation on the bevel scroll in a fence, I think in London. And it's super, super like Art Nouveau, and it's very extreme. It has almost no negative space. And it's a fun one to figure out how I would make it. So I love the variations here. It's hard enough to make a good one, but doing variations just takes you to a whole other place.
do we have any further questions? If not, which is how it looks, then maybe I say thank you, Beth. We magically managed to stretch time such that we finished just in time.
Perfect.
Yeah, thank you a lot for giving this presentation and taking the effort of making it. And it shows also now in the chat that there are plenty of other people who have the similar thoughts. The next Treff will be only in next year, so this is the last Treff for this year. And yeah, we're taking some off for Christmas season. And the next Treff will be held by Michael Sujewinsky. And I got to know he will talk about a flower hook thing on my behalf and on behalf of the whole team. Have a wonderful Christmas season, everyone. Hopefully it does get rather nice than busy and stressful for everyone. And have a great transition into the next year. The next Treff will be, and this will also be announced on the website, on the 15th of January.